August 4th, 1987, Harlem Hospital, New York City. A 19-day-old baby girl lies in a hospital crib, burning with a fever of 104 degrees. By dawn, the crib is empty. The IV line dangles loose. The baby is gone. No cameras, no witnesses, no trace. It was the first infant abduction in New York City's history, a case that shocked the city and would stay cold for 23 years until the missing child herself uncovered the truth. But how does a newborn vanish from one of the busiest hospitals in America without anyone noticing she was gone? Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive mystery stories. July 15th, 1987, Harlem, New York. Joy White was 16 years old when she gave birth to Carlina White. She was still in high school, living with her mother in a Harlem housing project. The father, Tyson, was 22. He worked two jobs, driving a truck during the day, parking cars at night, trying to build something stable for his new family. Carl didn't live with Joy and the baby. He'd visit after work, bringing diapers and formula, spending whatever time he could with his daughter. It wasn't ideal, but they were making it work. They were young, scared, but in love with this tiny life they'd created. For 19 days, everything felt manageable. Carlina was healthy, alert, perfect. Joy would dress her in little outfits with matching bows. Carl would hold her for hours, mesmerized by every sound she made. Then, on the night of August 4th, everything changed. Carlina's temperature spiked to 104 degrees. Joy felt the heat radiating from her daughter's tiny body and immediately panicked. She called Carl, who rushed over from work. Together, they drove Carlina to Harlem Hospital Center, the same place where she'd been born less than 3 weeks earlier. The emergency room was crowded that night. Nurses moved between patients with practiced efficiency. Doctors examined Carlina and quickly diagnosed an infection. She'd swallowed amniotic fluid during delivery. It wasn't life-threatening, they assured Joy and Carl, but serious enough to require overnight observation and IV antibiotics. Joy didn't want to leave. Every maternal instinct told her to stay by her daughter's side, but the hospital was packed, the waiting room chairs were hard and uncomfortable, and Carl looked exhausted after pulling a double shift. They sat in the waiting area, torn between staying and going home to rest. That's when the woman appeared. She was heavy-set, in her mid-20s, wearing a white nurse's uniform. She approached Joy and Carl with a calm, reassuring demeanor. She told them their baby would be fine, that they looked tired, that they should go home, get some rest, and come back in the morning when they were fresh. Carl remembered something odd she said to Joy, who was crying. "The baby don't cry for you, you cry for the baby." It struck him as strange, almost insensitive, but he was too exhausted to think much of it. Eventually, they agreed. Carl would take Joy back to her mother's apartment to pick up some things, then bring her back to spend the night at the hospital. They left the building sometime after 2:30 a.m., believing their daughter was in safe hands. It was a decision that would haunt them for the next 23 years. Somewhere between 2:30 a.m. and 3:55 a.m. on August 4th, 1987, someone entered the pediatric ward of Harlem Hospital. She disconnected the IV line from baby Carlina's arm. She lifted her from the crib, and she walked out of the building into the early morning darkness. No alarm sounded. No one noticed. The baby simply vanished. A security guard later reported seeing a heavy-set woman leaving the hospital around 3:30 a.m. She was moving quickly toward the exit. No infant was visible in her arms, but he noted that she was large enough to conceal a baby beneath her coat. He didn't think anything of it at the time. Hospital staff came and went at all hours. At 6 a.m., Carl Tyson's phone rang. He was asleep at his own apartment when Joy's frantic voice came through the line. She was screaming, crying, barely coherent. Then another voice, calm, official, a detective. "Your daughter is missing from the hospital." Carl's mind went blank. Missing? From a hospital? How was that even possible? He threw on clothes and raced across town to meet Joy at Harlem Hospital. When he arrived, the pediatric ward was swarming with police officers. Yellow tape cordoned off sections of the floor. Nurses were being questioned. Staff schedules were being pulled. And Carlina's crib stood empty, the IV pole beside it, a small hospital blanket left behind. Joy was hysterical. She kept asking the same questions over and over. How could this happen? Where is my baby? Who would take her? The detectives tried to calm her, but there were no answers, only questions multiplying by the minute. The NYPD moved quickly. They interviewed everyone who'd been on duty that night: nurses, doctors, security guards, janitorial staff. Multiple people remembered seeing a woman near the pediatric unit over the past few weeks. She'd been there often, always in scrubs or a nurse's uniform, always lingering near the newborns. She was heavy-set, in her mid-20s, and she didn't work there. But no one had thought to question her, because hospitals are busy places, and she looked like she belonged. Joy and Carl described the woman who'd spoken to them in the waiting area, the one who'd told them to go home. Police sketched a composite, but it was dark. The details were hazy, and neither of them had gotten a good look at her face. When investigators checked the hospital's surveillance system, they discovered the cameras hadn't been recording. The footage from that night didn't exist. The one tool that could have identified the kidnapper was useless. Within days, the investigation had its first lead. Witnesses in Baltimore identified a woman who'd been seen at the hospital in the weeks prior. Police questioned her extensively, but nothing connected her directly to the abduction. The trail went cold almost immediately. This was the first infant abduction from a New York City hospital in recorded history. And as the investigation stalled, Joy White and Carl Tyson were left with nothing but an empty crib and a grief so profound it felt like drowning. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that their daughter was still alive, being raised just 45 miles north under a different name by the very woman who had smiled at them in that hospital waiting room. Anugeta Petway, known to everyone as Anne, grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in a household marked by violence. Her mother was abusive, beating her with belts and extension cords throughout her childhood. As a teenager in 1977, Anne was arrested for larceny in Waterbury and spent weeks in jail. By her 20s, she was determined to escape that legacy and create something different for herself. What she wanted more than anything was a baby. She got pregnant in her early 20s. Then she miscarried. She got pregnant again, another miscarriage, then a stillbirth, then another miscarriage. Each loss carved something deeper out of her, something that couldn't be filled with words or therapy or time. Friends and family members said she became obsessed with the idea of motherhood, talking constantly about babies, about needing to be a mother, about wanting to prove she could be different from the woman who raised her. In the summer of 1987, Anne told everyone she was pregnant again. She showed friends an ultrasound photo. She talked about nursery plans. She glowed with the kind of anticipation expectant mothers have. But it was all a lie. She wasn't pregnant. She couldn't stay pregnant. And the desperation that had been building inside her for years was about to explode into something criminal. By August, Anne was spending hours at hospitals around New York City. She'd dress in nurses' uniforms she'd stolen or bought secondhand. She'd walk through pediatric wards with the kind of confidence that made people assume she belonged there. She'd watch mothers with their newborns, imagining what it would feel like to hold a baby and call it hers. On the night of August 4th, 1987, Anne Petway walked into Harlem Hospital with a plan. She'd been surveilling the facility for weeks, learning the shift changes, noting the security gaps, identifying the moments when no one was paying attention. She found Joy White and Carl Tyson in the waiting area, two exhausted teenagers who looked like they could barely keep their eyes open. She told them exactly what they needed to hear. Go home. Rest. Your baby will be fine. Then she waited. When the moment was right, Anne entered the pediatric ward. She disconnected the IV from Carlina White's arm with practiced precision. She wrapped the feverish baby in her coat, holding her close to her body to muffle any cries. And she walked out of Harlem Hospital into the night, her heart pounding, knowing that if she got caught, her life was over. But no one stopped her. No one even looked twice. Within hours, Anne was back in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Within days, she was introducing the baby to friends and family as Nejdra Nance, the daughter she'd supposedly given birth to while out of town visiting relatives. People assumed the father was her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Robert Nance. No one asked for a birth certificate. No one questioned the timeline. No one thought to connect this suddenly appearing baby to the headlines screaming about a kidnapping in New York City. And just like that, Carlina White ceased to exist. In her place was a little girl named Nettie, who would grow up believing the woman who stole her was the only mother she'd ever known. In the weeks following Carlina's disappearance, the NYPD launched one of the most intensive missing child investigations in the city's history. Detectives followed every lead, no matter how thin. They interviewed dozens of hospital employees. They questioned visitors. They combed through years of security logs, looking for patterns. The case made national headlines. Baby snatched from Harlem Hospital. Television crews camped outside Joy's apartment building. Reporters shoved microphones in her face, asking her how it felt to lose her child. The questions were relentless, invasive, cruel in their repetition. Joy couldn't sleep. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced she heard Carlina crying. She'd run to the nursery only to find it empty. Carl threw himself into the search, plastering missing person flyers on every lamppost in Harlem, calling tip lines obsessively, refusing to believe his daughter was gone forever. But as the months dragged on, the story faded from the news. Other crimes took precedence. The file on Carlina White was moved to the Cold Case Division. In October 1988, Joy and Carl filed a lawsuit against Harlem Hospital, seeking $100 million in damages for negligence. The hospital's security failures were inexcusable, they argued. A baby should not be able to vanish from a guarded facility in one of the busiest cities on Earth. The lawsuit dragged on for years, finally settling in 1992 for $750,000. Half went directly to Joy and Carl. The other half was placed in a trust fund for Carlina, accessible only if she was found before her 21st birthday. Joy and Carl used their portion of the settlement to keep searching. They hired private investigators who chased leads across multiple states. They appeared on talk shows, Oprah, Montel Williams, anyone who would give them a platform. They never stopped hoping. In 1991, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created an age-progressed composite image of what Carlina might look like as she grew older. Forensic artist Steve Lofton used photos of Joy and Carlina's half-sister to model the projection, creating images showing how she might appear at ages 5, 10, and 15. The images were distributed to schools, police stations, and media outlets across the country. But no one recognized the girl in those images because she was living under a different name, in a different town, with no idea she'd been stolen. As the years turned into a decade, then 2 decades, Joy and Carl's relationship deteriorated under the weight of their shared trauma. They went their separate ways but remained in contact, bonded by the loss that defined both their lives. Carl had other children. Joy had other children. They both tried to move forward. But a part of them was always frozen in that hospital room on August 4th, 1987, staring at an empty crib. Meanwhile, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a little girl named Nettie Nance was learning to walk, learning to talk, attending school, celebrating birthdays, living a completely normal life, except for one thing: something always felt wrong. She didn't look like her mother. Baby photos didn't make sense. And whenever she asked questions about her past, the woman who raised her would shut down or change the subject. The answers Nettie needed were just 45 miles away. But it would take 23 years and her own determination before those two worlds finally collided. Nedra Nance, Nettie to everyone who knew her, had what looked like a normal childhood from the outside. She attended Thomas Hooker School in Bridgeport. She had friends. She went to birthday parties and sleepovers. She smiled in school photos. But inside the house she shared with Ann Petway, things were different. Ann wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. She fed Nettie. She clothed her. She made sure she went to school and did her homework. But she was also volatile, unpredictable. When she was angry, she'd throw things, shoes, books, whatever was within reach. The household was chaotic, always one crisis away from falling apart. Ann moved from job to job, always one step ahead of her next probation violation for various theft and embezzlement charges. In 1998, when Nettie was 11 years old, Ann gave birth to a biological son named Trevin Teal. Nettie adored him instantly. She helped change his diapers, fed him bottles, rocked him to sleep. She believed he was her half-brother and loved him fiercely. She had no reason to suspect that the family she thought she belonged to wasn't actually hers. But even as a child, Nettie felt something was fundamentally wrong. She didn't look like Ann, not at all. Ann was light-skinned with delicate features. Nettie was darker, with a rounder face and completely different bone structure. When she'd look at family photos, she'd search for herself in Ann's features and find nothing. When she'd ask about her father, Ann's answers were vague and constantly changing. When she'd ask about baby photos, the pictures Ann showed her didn't quite add up. The infant was lighter-skinned than Nettie remembered being. By middle school, the questions had multiplied. Why didn't she have a birth certificate? Every time school enrollment came around or she needed one for sports teams, Ann would make excuses. It was lost. It was damaged in a fire. It was somewhere she couldn't find. Nettie would watch other kids pull out their birth certificates easily, while hers remained mysteriously absent. There were whispers in the extended family, too. Relatives who seemed to know something they wouldn't say out loud. Conversations that would stop abruptly when Nettie entered the room. A feeling always present that she was on the outside of some truth everyone else understood. As Nettie moved through her teenage years, she began to suspect that something fundamental about her life was a lie, but she had no proof, no resources, no idea where to even begin looking for answers. So she did what a lot of teenagers do. She pushed the questions down, focused on getting through high school, and tried to survive in an unstable household. She graduated from Warren Harding High School in 2005. She got a job. She tried to move forward with her life, but the doubt never left. It sat in the back of her mind like a stone, growing heavier with each passing year, each unanswered question, each time she looked in the mirror and wondered who she really was. And then, in 2005, when Nettie was 18 years old and pregnant with her first child, the fragile web of lies Ann had maintained for nearly 2 decades finally began to unravel. Nettie was excited about becoming a mother. She was also terrified. She was young, unmarried, working a low-wage job, and living in a household that barely functioned. But she was determined to do everything right for her baby, which meant she needed health insurance, government assistance, medical care, which meant she needed a birth certificate. She'd been asking Ann for one for years. The answer was always the same evasive response. But this time, Nettie wasn't taking no for an answer. Her baby's health depended on it. She needed that document, and she needed it now. After weeks of pressure, Ann finally handed over a birth certificate. Nettie held the paper in her hands, examining it carefully. It looked official enough at first glance. Her name, Nedra Nance. Place of birth, Bridgeport, Connecticut. Date of birth matched what she'd always been told. But something about it felt off. The paper quality seemed wrong. The print was slightly blurred. The official seal looked almost too perfect, like it had been photocopied rather than embossed. She took it to the Department of Social Services and submitted it with her application for assistance. The clerk picked it up, glanced at it for maybe 5 seconds, and looked up at Nettie with a confused expression. "This is fake." Nettie's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "This isn't a real birth certificate. It's a forgery. You can't use this." Nettie felt the world tilt beneath her feet. A forgery. Why would Anne have a forged birth certificate with her name on it? What possible reason could there be except... She went home that night and confronted Anne directly for the first time in her life. No more accepting vague answers. No more letting it go. She demanded the truth. Anne's face crumpled. For a moment she looked like she might break down completely. Then, slowly, the lies started to crack. Anne admitted that Nettie wasn't her biological daughter. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. But even in this moment of confession, Anne couldn't tell the whole truth. Instead, she constructed a new lie to replace the old one. She claimed that Nettie's real mother had been a drug addict who abandoned her as a baby, that Anne had found her, taken her in out of pure kindness and compassion, that she'd raised her, loved her, given her a life she wouldn't have had otherwise. In Anne's version of events, she was a hero, not a criminal. Nettie wanted desperately to believe her. Part of her needed this to be a story about rescue rather than theft. But it didn't make sense. Why forge a birth certificate if you'd legitimately adopted a child? Why lie for 18 years? Why refuse to provide any information about this supposed biological mother, not even a name? She demanded more answers. Anne shut down completely. The conversation ended with more questions than it had started with, and a gulf opened between them that would never fully close. Nettie gave birth to her daughter, Samani, in 2006. As she held her newborn for the first time, she thought about her own mother, whoever she really was. The questions that had always lived quietly in the back of her mind now roared with urgent intensity. Who am I? Where did I come from? What is my real name? For the next 5 years, those questions haunted her. She moved to Atlanta with Anne and Anne's sister, Cassandra Johnson, trying to start fresh, trying to build a life on a foundation she knew was made of lies. She worked. She raised her daughter. She went through the motions of normal life. But she couldn't let it go. The questions followed her through every birthday, every holiday, every milestone. They kept her awake at night. They whispered to her in quiet moments. They demanded answers that Anne refused to provide. By late 2010, Nettie couldn't take it anymore. The need to know the truth had become overwhelming, all-consuming. She needed to understand who she really was. And if Anne wouldn't tell her, she'd find out herself. December 2010, Atlanta, Georgia. Late at night. Nettie sat alone in her apartment, her 5-year-old daughter asleep in the next room. The glow of her laptop screen illuminated her face in the darkness. She'd been thinking about this for weeks, building up the courage to actually do it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Finally, she typed, "Babies kidnapped 1987. The search results loaded, hundreds of them, missing children, cold cases, families still searching decades later, stories of hope and heartbreak, most ending without resolution. She felt a knot form in her stomach. Was she really going to do this? Was she really about to accuse the only mother she'd ever known of kidnapping? She clicked on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children website. The homepage showed a rotating display of missing children's faces, some recent, some from decades ago. She navigated to the search function and entered her birth year, 1987. A list of cases appeared, each one a small thumbnail photo of a baby who'd been taken. She scrolled slowly, her heart pounding, examining each face. Some cases were from other states. Some had been solved. Many had ended tragically. And then she stopped. A photo of a baby with dark eyes and full cheeks stared back at her from the screen. The resemblance was immediate and undeniable. She clicked on the case file, and her entire world shifted. Carlina White, abducted from Harlem Hospital, New York City, August 4th, 1987, last seen at 19 days old. More images loaded. Baby Carlina, and next to it, an age-progressed composite showing what she might look like as an adult. Nettie's hands began to shake. She opened another browser tab and pulled up photos of herself as an infant that Anne had shown her over the years. Then photos of her daughter, Samani. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The same eyes, the same facial structure, the same expressions. And then she saw it, the detail that made her breath catch in her throat. Carlina White had a distinctive birthmark on her arm. Nettie pulled up her sleeve. The birthmark was in the exact same place. She read every word of the case file. Harlem Hospital, high fever. A woman in a nurse's uniform who told the parents to go home, parents named Joy White and Carl Tyson. The baby disappeared between 2:30 and 4 a.m. Surveillance cameras weren't working. Every single detail fit. The fake birth certificate, Anne's refusal to discuss the past, the way she'd always seemed like she was hiding something. The inconsistencies in the stories, it all made horrifying sense. Nettie sat in the dark for a long time, just staring at the photo of baby Carlina White. Her mind was racing. If this was true, if she really was this stolen baby, then her entire life had been built on a lie. Her name wasn't real. Her birthday might not even be accurate. The woman she called Mother was actually her kidnapper. And somewhere out there were two people who'd spent 23 years searching for her. She called Anne's sister, Cassandra Johnson, who was living with them in Atlanta. Cassandra came to look at the computer screen. She examined the photos carefully, comparing them to pictures of Nettie. After a long silence, she looked at Nettie and said quietly, "I think you need to call them." Nettie picked up her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial. When the operator at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children answered, Nettie's voice was barely above a whisper. "I think I might be a missing child. I think I might be Carlina White." The operator's tone shifted immediately from routine to intensely focused. She asked Nettie to explain everything: the fake birth certificate, the physical similarities, the birthmark, the timeline that matched perfectly. As Nettie talked, the operator took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Nettie finished, there was a brief pause. Then the operator said something that would change 3 lives forever. "I think you might be right. We're going to look into this immediately." Within 48 hours, investigators from the National Center were reaching out to Nettie. They asked for photos, any documentation she had, medical records if possible, anything that could help confirm her identity. They compared the images she sent with the photos they had on file. The resemblance was striking. The birthmark was a perfect match. Then, just before Christmas 2010, they did something Joy White and Carl Tyson had been praying for every single day for 23 years. They sent an email to Joy. The subject line contained words she'd dreamed of reading for more than 2 decades. "We may have found your daughter." Joy White stared at her email inbox, reading the message from NC MEC over and over, afraid that if she looked away, it might disappear. "We may have found your daughter." She'd been through this before: false leads, mistaken identities, women who thought they might be Carlina but weren't. Each time had reopened the wound, made the grief fresh again, but this time felt different. She immediately called the NYPD. Detective Martin Brown answered. Joy was so excited she could barely form coherent sentences. "A woman calls and she's very excited on the phone," Detective Brown would later recall, describes that she had just been contacted recently by someone living in Atlanta claiming that she was her long-lost daughter from 23 years ago. Detective Brown contacted the National Center. They sent him the photos Nettie had submitted. He pulled up the original case file, looked at the baby pictures of Carlina, examined the age-progressed composites. Then he looked at the photos of Nettie. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just another false lead. This was real. In early January 2011, DNA samples were collected. Nettie submitted hers at a facility in Atlanta. Joy and Carl submitted theirs in New York. The samples were sent to a laboratory for analysis. Then came the waiting. For Nettie, those weeks were agonizing. What if she was wrong? What if this was all just her desperate mind, grasping at answers, seeing patterns that weren't really there? What if the DNA came back negative, and she was left with nothing but more questions and the humiliation of having made such a public claim? For Joy and Carl, the weight was equally unbearable. They'd learned long ago not to get their hopes up, not to invest too much emotion in leads that might go nowhere. But this time, they couldn't help themselves. This time felt like it might actually be the answer they'd been searching for. On January 15, 2011, the laboratory results came back. It was a match. DNA confirmed with 99.9% certainty that Nejdra Nance was Carlina Renee White. Joy White collapsed when she got the call. She sobbed into the phone, thanking God, thanking the detectives, thanking everyone who'd never stopped looking. Her daughter was alive. After 23 years of wondering, praying, searching through the darkest possibilities, her daughter was alive. Carl Tyson stood in his apartment, phone pressed to his ear, unable to speak for several long moments. When he finally found his voice, all he could say was, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The news hit the media immediately. Stolen baby found after 23 years. Woman solves her own kidnapping. Miracle reunion after nearly quarter century. It was everywhere. CNN, ABC, NBC, every major news outlet picked up the story. It was the kind of miracle that almost never happens in cases like this. But what the headlines didn't capture, what couldn't be captured in a soundbite, was the complexity of what came next. The reunion was arranged for the same day the DNA results were confirmed, January 15, 2011. It would take place at a Manhattan hotel, neutral territory where media presence could be controlled. Nettie flew in from Atlanta that morning, her stomach in knots the entire flight. She was about to meet the people who gave birth to her, the people who'd been searching for her for 23 years, the people she had absolutely no memory of. Joy White arrived at the hotel early. She couldn't sit still. She paced the lobby, checked her watch obsessively, smoothed down her clothes, reapplied her lipstick. Carl Tyson stood nearby, quieter, trying to keep his emotions in check, but visibly shaking. When Nettie finally walked through the door, time seemed to stop. Joy saw her daughter and immediately broke down. She rushed forward, pulling Nettie into a tight embrace, sobbing uncontrollably into her shoulder. My baby, you're here. You're really here." Carl stepped forward, wrapping his arms around both of them, tears streaming down his face. For several minutes, they just stood there in the hotel lobby, holding each other, crying, trying to process the fact that this moment was actually happening after 23 years of grief and searching. For Nettie, the moment was overwhelming in a completely different way. These were her parents. Biology and DNA confirmed it. But they were also complete strangers. She had no memory of them, no shared history, no foundation on which to build a relationship. They were looking at her with love and longing and 23 years of accumulated emotion, but all she felt was confusion, disorientation, and a complicated grief for the life she'd thought she had. The media was waiting outside. Cameras, reporters, everyone wanted a piece of the miracle story. Joy hung banners in her apartment building later that day. Reunited, and it feels so good, and back together again at last. She gave interview after interview, smiling through tears, talking about how complete she finally felt. But behind the smiles and the banners, tensions were already forming. Joy and Carl wanted their daughter back in every sense. They wanted to make up for lost time, to insert themselves into her life, to build the relationship they'd been robbed of. They introduced her to her half-siblings, children they'd each had with other partners in the years after Carlina disappeared. They showed her baby photos. They told her stories about the night she was taken. They described the years of searching, the false leads, the moments when they'd almost given up hope. But for Nettie, it was too much too fast. She was still processing the fact that her entire existence had been based on a lie. She was grieving the mother she'd thought she had, the woman who'd raised her but had also stolen her. She was angry at Anne, angry at the hospital, angry at the universe for putting her in this impossible situation, and she wasn't ready to instantly become the daughter Joy and Carl wanted her to be. "I'm happy to be reunited with my biological family," she told reporters carefully. "But it's complicated. The woman who raised me is the only mother I've ever known." Those words, however honest, cut Joy deeply. Within days, the euphoria of the reunion began to curdle into something more complicated. A few weeks after the reunion, Nettie's attorney advised her to ask about the trust fund. She needed to understand what had happened to the money that was supposed to have been set aside for her. The $750,000 settlement. Half had gone directly to Joy and Carl in 1992. The other half was supposed to have been placed in a trust fund for Carlina, accessible only if she was found before her 21st birthday. Nettie was now 23. The deadline had passed 2 years earlier. She asked Joy and Carl what had happened to the money. The conversation was awkward, tense. Joy and Carl explained that over the years, the money had been spent. They'd used it to hire private investigators, to travel to other states chasing leads, to pay for their own living expenses, to take care of the other children they'd had. There was nothing left in the trust. Nettie said she understood, that it wasn't about the money, that she just wanted to know the truth. But internally, she was hurt. That money had been meant for her. It represented the life she'd been stolen from, the future she should have had. Joy later told reporters that Carlina had started talking about only doing media interviews if she was paid. That money had become a point of contention between them. "We don't have the money," Joy said in one interview, sounding defensive. "We both had to live. I have 2 other kids, you know. I had to take care of myself." Carl handled the situation differently. He understood that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, that 23 years couldn't be erased with a single reunion. He texted Nettie every day, good morning messages, check-ins, photos of family gatherings she wasn't attending. He called her regularly just to hear her voice, never pushing, always patient. "In this relationship, you can't push nothing," he told reporters. "There's 23 years I can't get back. Everything has to start from here and work its way." But Joy felt differently. She'd waited 23 years to get her daughter back, and now that Carlina was here, she wanted her fully back. She wanted her at family dinners. She wanted her calling every day. She wanted the relationship she'd been robbed of. When Nettie pulled away, Joy interpreted it as rejection. By summer 2011, just 6 months after the miracle reunion, Nettie had stopped returning Joy's calls. She'd flown back to Atlanta and made it clear she needed space. The relationship that everyone had hoped would heal decades of trauma had instead created new wounds. Joy told reporters it felt like losing her daughter all over again. "It breaks my heart listening to her talk about her auntie or her little brother when she means Ann Petway's family, not ours. I'm her mother, not Ann Petway." The reunion everyone had prayed for had become another kind of loss, and while the biological family struggled to rebuild what had been stolen, law enforcement was moving to ensure the woman who'd caused all this pain would finally face justice. On January 21, 2011, just 6 days after the DNA results confirmed Carlina's identity, an arrest warrant was issued for Ann Petway. She was already wanted in North Carolina for violating probation on an embezzlement conviction. She'd pleaded guilty to stealing cash and clothing from a Hudson Belk store where she'd worked. But now she was facing something far more serious: federal kidnapping charges. Ann knew it was coming. She'd known from the moment Nettie called the hotline that her world was about to collapse. The secret she'd carried for 23 years was finally out, and there was no more running from it. On the morning of January 23, 2011, Ann drove from North Carolina to Bridgeport, Connecticut. She needed to arrange care for her 13-year-old biological son, Trevin. She needed to make sure he'd be taken care of while she was in prison. She knew she wasn't coming back anytime soon. Then she walked into the FBI field office in Bridgeport and turned herself in. When federal agents took her into custody, witnesses said she looked almost relieved. The lying was over. The running was over. The weight she'd been carrying for more than 2 decades was finally being lifted, even if it meant prison. In her confession to federal investigators, Ann Petway explained why she'd done it. She described the miscarriages in vivid, painful detail, the stillbirths that had broken her, the desperate need to be a mother that had consumed her every waking moment. She explained how she'd spent weeks watching Harlem Hospital, learning the patterns, identifying the security gaps. She told them about approaching Joy and Carl in the waiting room that night, about waiting for the right moment, about disconnecting the IV, wrapping the feverish baby in her coat, and walking out with her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She admitted she knew it was wrong, that she'd thought about confessing 1,000 times over the years. But the longer she waited, the harder it became. And as Nettie grew up and convinced herself she was giving the child a better life than she would have had with teenage parents in the projects, that she'd saved her, not stolen her. "I loved her," Ann told investigators, tears streaming down her face. "I raised her as my own. I never hurt her. I gave her everything I had." But the FBI agents reminded her that love doesn't erase kidnapping, that you can't steal someone's entire identity and call it rescue. Ann was charged with kidnapping under federal law. The statute of limitations had expired under New York state law, but federal kidnapping charges carry no time limit. If convicted at trial, she faced a mandatory minimum of 20 years in prison and a maximum sentence of life. On February 17, 2011, a federal grand jury formally indicted Ann Petway on 1 count of kidnapping. She was held without bail, deemed a flight risk given her history and the severity of the charges. Ann's public defender, Robert Baum, reached out to Carlina in May 2011. He wanted her to consider testifying on Ann's behalf at sentencing, to tell the court that Ann had raised her, loved her, never physically abused her, that the situation was more complicated than the headlines suggested. Carlina agreed to meet with him. During that conversation, she admitted something that surprised many people. She still loved Ann. Despite everything, the lies, the stolen identity, the shattered sense of self, Ann was the only mother she'd ever known. She'd raised her, fed her, comforted her when she cried, celebrated her birthdays, helped her with homework. Those 23 years had been real, even if they were built on a crime. But Carlina also made it clear she wouldn't testify. By that point, she'd become estranged from both families. She'd moved back to Atlanta. She wanted nothing to do with the trial, the media circus, any of it. She just wanted to be left alone to process the wreckage of her life. On February 10, 2012, after nearly a year of legal proceedings, Ann Petway stood before federal Judge P. Kevin Castell and pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping. As part of a plea agreement, prosecutors agreed to recommend a sentence of 10 to 12.5 years in federal prison. The child victim specification of the kidnapping charge was dropped in exchange for her guilty plea. The sentencing hearing was held on July 30, 2012. The courtroom was packed with media, law enforcement, and members of both families. Ann stood before the judge, now 50 years old, her hands shaking. "I would like to apologize to the family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it may be rejected, but I am deeply sorry for what I've done. I'm here today to right my wrong." Her defense attorneys argued for leniency. They presented evidence of Ann's traumatic childhood, the abuse, the violence, the lack of any stable foundation. They emphasized her history of mental illness, the depression that had consumed her after the miscarriages. They pointed out that Carlina had not been physically harmed, that she'd been fed, clothed, educated, raised in what Ann believed was love. They argued that Ann's crime while serious, was born from psychological trauma rather than malice, that she deserved compassion, treatment, a chance at redemption. Judge Castell listened to all of it. Then he delivered his ruling. "This was not a crime of greed or vengeance," he said, his voice measured but firm. "But it was deeply, profoundly selfish. Ann Petway inflicted a parent's worst nightmare on Joy White and Carl Tyson. She deprived them of their daughter's entire childhood, first steps, first words, first day of school, graduation, all of it. She robbed Carlina White of her true identity, of knowing her real family, of growing up with her biological siblings. The damage she caused is immeasurable and irreversible." He paused, looking directly at Anne. "No amount of claimed love can justify what you did. You didn't save this child. You stole her." He sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison, plus 3 years of supervised release. Outside the courthouse afterward, Carl Tyson was visibly angry, shaking with emotion. 12 years? She took 23 years from us, he said, his voice rising. "I wanted to reach over there and strangle her, to be honest. It's not enough. It will never be enough." Joy White stood beside him, exhausted and hollow-eyed. She'd gotten justice, but it felt empty. Nothing could give her back the years she'd lost. Nothing could erase the trauma. The sentence was something, but it wasn't closure. Ann Petway was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Aliceville, Alabama. She served her sentence quietly, away from the media spotlight, away from the families she'd destroyed. She participated in prison programs. She reportedly expressed remorse to other inmates. She counted down the days. On April 14, 2021, after serving nearly 10 years with time off for good behavior, Ann Petway was released from federal prison. She began 3 years of supervised release, living somewhere in the United States under conditions set by the court. She was forbidden from contacting Carlina without permission. She had to report regularly to a probation officer. She had to rebuild a life everyone would forever know her for destroying. As for Carlina, she didn't attend the sentencing hearing. She told prosecutors she wanted nothing to do with it, that she needed to focus on her own healing. But years later, she admitted something that shocked many people. She'd written letters to Anne in prison. That despite everything, she still loved her in some complicated, painful way. That forgiveness, for her, wasn't about forgetting or excusing what happened. It was about not letting anger consume what was left of her life. By 2014, 3 years after the reunion, Carlina had slowly begun reconnecting with Joy and Carl. The relationship was still fragile, still laden with unspoken resentments and complicated emotions, but it existed. She told reporters she now had 2 moms and 2 dads, and that while it was messy and painful, her life was richer because of it. She said the issue over the trust fund money had been a misunderstanding, that she'd moved past it. Whether that was completely true or just what she needed to say publicly, only she knew. She legally kept her name as Carlina Renee White, but she continued going by Nettie in her daily life. It was the name she'd chosen for herself, the one that belonged to neither family, but to her alone. It represented her agency, her decision to define herself rather than let her identity be determined by what had been done to her. In 2012, Lifetime aired a television movie about her case called Abducted, the Carlina White story. Actress Keke Palmer portrayed Carlina in a dramatized version of events. The film brought renewed national attention to the case and sparked important conversations about hospital security protocols nationwide. Carlina's case became a catalyst for change: stricter infant security measures, mandatory functioning surveillance systems, better training for staff to identify suspicious behavior. In 2014, Carlina spoke publicly at the Crimes Against Children conference. She stood before an audience of law enforcement officers, child advocates, and social workers, and shared her story not as a victim, but as a survivor. She talked about identity, about resilience, about the power of asking questions even when you're terrified of the answers. She talked about forgiveness, not as absolution for the person who hurt you, but as liberation for yourself. "If I had all that anger in me," she said, "it would be me who would suffer. It would stop me from living my life." Since then, Carlina has chosen to live privately, away from the media spotlight that consumed the first years after her discovery. She's raising her daughter, Samani, now a teenager. She's navigating the impossible complexity of loving two families who will never fully coexist in her world. She's building a life that belongs entirely to her. She maintains relationships with both Joy and Carl, though neither is particularly close. Carl continues to text her regularly. Joy has learned to give her space. They see each other on holidays sometimes. It's not the fairy tale reunion anyone hoped for, but it's real, and maybe that's more valuable. Carlina's case remains the longest-known infant abduction in U.S. history, where the victim was successfully reunited with their biological family. It's also the first case in the history of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, in which the victim led their own reunification efforts without any external intervention triggering the discovery. She didn't wait to be saved. She saved herself. Today, Carlina White is in her late 30s. She lives a life that doesn't make headlines anymore. She works. She raises her daughter. She navigates the ordinary challenges everyone faces: bills, relationships, the daily grind of existence. She doesn't do interviews. She doesn't want to be forever defined by what was taken from her. She wants to be known for who she is now, for what she's built from the wreckage, for the person she's chosen to become, despite everything. Ann Petway is free now, living somewhere under supervised release. She will be on probation until 2024. After that, she'll be free to rebuild whatever life she can, but she will forever be known as the woman who stole a baby from a hospital. That will be her legacy, no matter what else she does. Joy White and Carl Tyson are still in New York, still trying to understand a reunion that didn't heal the way reunions are supposed to in the movies. They have their daughter back, but not in the way they imagined during those 23 years of searching. Not in the way anyone imagines a happy ending. Because this story doesn't have a neat conclusion. It doesn't tie up with a bow. It ends the way most true stories do, with people doing their best to move forward, carrying the weight of what was lost and what was found in equal measure. Carlina's case changed hospital security nationwide. ID bans with alarm systems for newborns, instant alerts when babies are moved, surveillance systems that actually work, access protocols that require multiple levels of verification. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that safety is never guaranteed and that the most dangerous people are often the ones who look like they belong. But more than that, Carlina's story is a testament to the power of instinct, to the voice inside that says something is wrong, even when everyone around you insists everything is fine, to the courage it takes to ask questions when you're afraid of the answers, to the strength required to face a truth that shatters everything you thought you knew about yourself. Carlina White listened to that voice. She asked those questions. She faced that truth. And it led her home, not to a place, not to a family, but to herself. And perhaps that's the most powerful part of her story, that after 23 years of living someone else's lie, she finally discovered her own truth. And she did it herself. Thanks for watching. If this story got to you, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next mystery. See you soon.